People always ask the wrong question. They want to know what it felt like to hold Keth Varath through the night. Whether I was afraid, whether I knew I could do it, whether some part of me was thinking about her the whole time. They want a story about courage with a clean shape to it. A man who decided something and then did it. The truth is quieter than that. The truth is I was mostly cold and angry about a drafty corridor I hadn't been able to fix for 3 weeks because no one would give me the material requisition forms. And by the time Sovar's advance units sealed the pass, I had stopped thinking about Seren Vol almost entirely. Which is a strange thing to admit, given how the night ended. But I think it matters. I think it's the only part that matters, actually. So let me start where it really starts. Not the night of the siege, the night of the feast. I arrived at Keth Varath in the 3rd month of the Compact's new diplomatic calendar. The consort arrangement had been negotiated between my government and the Theresi Compact over the course of about a year and a half. A formal bond, stabilize the northern reaches, to put a human presence at the table of the Queen Commander's household, signal to the border factions that the Compact and the human sphere were no longer just trading partners, but something with more weight to it. I was chosen because I spoke 3 Theresi dialects, because I had served the fleet for 22 years and understood military infrastructure, and my handler at the consulate was very honest about this. I was unlikely to say anything stupid at a state dinner. I was 44 years old. I had a scar along my left jaw from a pressure door accident on a patrol frigate 11 years prior. I owned exactly 2 formal garments, both of which were issued to me by the consulate the week before I shipped out. I was not what anyone would call a romantic figure. My handler said that too. She meant it kindly. Fortress of Keth Varath sat at the top of a mountain pass that the Theresi called the Throat of the North, a narrow channel of rock and wind between 2 ranges that had been fortified for something close to 400 years. Court structure was the 3rd on that site. The first 2 had been burned. The walls were black basalt, 3 meters thick at the base, and the wind off the upper peaks came through the arrow slots in the garrison hall, with a sound like something breathing in a language you couldn't quite parse. I liked it immediately. I have always felt cleaner in places that don't pretend to be comfortable. Seren Vol met me in the outer courtyard. She was tall for Theresi. Most of them run lean and long-limbed, which I had known from briefings but not quite registered until I was standing in front of her. Skin was the copper bronze that the northern bloodlines carry, the kind that catches even winter light and gives it back warm. Hair was close-cropped, obsidian dark, and she wore it without ornament. Eyes were amber, not the clean warm amber of the briefing photographs, but something more complex, fractured. Dark rings around the iris, like cracks in old glass. She had a way of looking at you, as though she were reading a document she had already decided contained nothing useful. She looked at me that way for about 4 seconds. Then she turned and walked inside. Her chamberlain, a small man named Orath, with the careful politeness of someone who has spent decades smoothing over the edges of other people's behavior, fell into step beside me and explained in a low voice that the Queen Commander had reviewed my service record and found it adequate. I thanked him. He looked at me as though I had said something puzzling. The feast that evening was in the Great Hall, which was not particularly great. Perhaps 40 meters long. With ceiling beams that had been replaced so many times, the wood was all different ages. Colors, like a mouthful of mismatched teeth. 43 members of Seren Vol's court were present, ranging from her senior SEAL battle commanders, the administrators of the northern trade routes, to 2 junior advisors, who looked young enough that I wondered if they had finished their secondary schooling. Long tables, candlelight, because the fortress's electrical grid was on partial shutdown for a maintenance cycle. Theresi wine, which is made from something that grows in the high passes and tastes like pine resin and winter. And a 3rd thing I have never been able to name. I sat at the Queen Commander's right hand. This was protocol, not preference. I understood that from the first moment. Seren Vol sat at the head of the table with the particular stillness of someone who has been performing command. For so long it has become structural, part of how she holds her spine. She spoke to her commanders on her left with ease. She spoke to me when courtesy required it. and not otherwise. About an hour into the feast, one of her senior commanders, a broad-shouldered woman named Veth Karis, who wore her battle honors on her collar and had the look of someone who had never once questioned her right to take up space, leaned across the table and asked me what I had done in the fleet. I told her, warrant officer, 22 years infrastructure and logistics specialist, the last 8 years focused on military installation maintenance and emergency repair protocols. Veth Karis nodded slowly. So you fixed things, she said. Yes, I said. And now you are here, she said, to be fixed to our Queen Commander's household. There was a particular kind of laughter that moved around that table. Not loud. Not cruel exactly. More like a door being closed on a subject that didn't require further examination. I picked up my wine glass and drank from it. Pine resin taste sat on the back of my tongue. Saren Vole did not laugh. But she also did not say anything. She looked at the middle distance, the way you look when something is happening at the edge of your awareness that you have decided not to formally acknowledge. That was the moment, that I understood my position at Kethvarath clearly. I was not there as a partner. I was there as a symbol, a diplomatic object, present and accounted for, whose function was to exist within the Queen Commander's household and be noted in the treaty documents and otherwise not require anything of anyone. I finished my wine. I ate the food that was brought to me. I spoke when spoken to and not otherwise. When the feast ended, I walked back to the consort's quarters, which were on the west side of the fortress, and caught the wind, something fierce, and I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the black stone wall and thought about the requisition forms I would need to file in the morning. That is how the first night at Kethvarath ended. The weeks that followed had a shape to them. I learned the fortress. This was partly by intention. I had been an infrastructure specialist for most of my adult life, and I cannot walk into a building without my mind beginning to map it, noting the load-bearing elements, the utility runs, the places where the construction is old, and the places where it has been patched, and partly by necessity, because the only way to be invisible without being useless is to know the place you're inhabiting well enough that you can navigate it without bothering anyone. Kethvarath had been built in stages across 4 centuries, and the result was a kind of organized confusion, newer sections grafted onto older ones, with varying degrees of competence. The heating system was a particular problem. The Theresi use a radiant floor system fed by a central thermal plant in the fortress's lowest level, and at Kethvarath, the plant was original, meaning it was 400 years old, maintained but never replaced, and the distribution channels that carried heat to the outer walls had developed blockages that meant the eastern garrison wing ran about 11 degrees colder than the rest of the fortress. I identified this within the first week. I asked Orath about the requisition process for maintenance materials. He gave me a form. I filled out the form. The form went somewhere and didn't come back. So I walked the corridors. I noted things. I spoke to the garrison soldiers, most of whom treated me with a kind of studied neutrality. Not hostile, exactly. More like the careful behavior of people who were not sure which category I belonged to, and had decided to wait for further information. I ate in the garrison hall with them rather than taking meals in the consort's quarters, which I think surprised them. I fixed a door mechanism in the northern barracks that had been sticking for 2 months, using parts I had requested through Orath, and received 3 days later with no explanation for why the smaller request had been approved when the larger one hadn't. I did not point this out. Saren Vole I saw at formal occasions and at a brief administrative meeting each week that was required by the treaty terms. She was always precise at these meetings, always prepared, always correct in her acknowledgement of my presence. She never looked at me the way she had in the courtyard on the first day. She looked at me the way you look at something that is exactly where it is supposed to be, which requires no further attention. I did not try to change this. I want to be clear about that. I have spent my life in institutional environments, military vessels, relay stations, border installations, and I understand the difference between a situation that can be changed and a situation that cannot. I have never seen the point of expending energy on the second kind. Saren Vole had made a judgment. Judgments of that kind, in my experience, don't respond to argument. They respond to time or to evidence. or sometimes to nothing at all. You work with what's in front of you. What was in front of me was a drafty fortress with an aging heating plant and a maintenance backlog of about 3 years, and a garrison of 62 soldiers who were doing their jobs with the quiet competence of people who had been in a hard place for a long time and had made their peace with it. I liked them. I liked the fortress. I liked the sound the wind made through the arrow slots. 43 days after my arrival, Kreth Sovar sealed the pass. I should explain Sovar, because he matters. Sovar was the lord of the Hathgan Basin, which to the south of the mountain range that Keth Vareth commanded. He was old nobility, Thorethi border faction, the kind of bloodline that had been significant for 300 years and was becoming less significant with each generation and knew it, and had the particular bitterness of things that used to be important. He had opposed the diplomatic arrangement with the human sphere from the beginning, on grounds that were partly ideological and partly practical. The arrangement gave the compact's northern reaches a stability that reduced the border faction's leverage. Kreth Sovar's power was built almost entirely on that leverage. The consort arrangement specifically offended him. A human male in the Queen Commander's household was not just a diplomatic concession. It was a statement about what the future of the compact looked like, and Safar had decided he was not willing to let that statement stand unchallenged. I knew all of this from the briefing documents. What the briefing documents had not quite conveyed was how quickly he moved when he decided to act. So Sovar's forces came through the eastern approach in the middle of the night. They had scouts in the pass for at least a week before the attack. I understand this now, in retrospect, and they chose their moment with care. The garrison's senior watch officer was a veteran named Thess, who had been at Keth Varath for 9 years. And she was good, but she was working with sensor equipment that had 3 dead nodes in the eastern array, a maintenance issue I had filed a report on 11 days prior. The report had gone the same place the heating requisition went. First breach was in the eastern supply gate. Sovar's advance unit was 12 fighters, lightly armed, moving fast, and they were through the gate before the alarm had properly reached the garrison hall. Thess got her soldiers moving inside 2 minutes, which was fast, genuinely fast, the kind of response time that only comes from years of practice. But 12 fighters inside a fortress wall is 12 fighters too many, and in the first engagement, in the corridor outside the supply gate, Thess took a blade across her right side and went down. She lived. I want to say that now because I was fond of Thess, and the telling of it has a way of making her sound like a casualty when she wasn't. She lived. But she was down, and she was out of the fight, and the garrison's command structure had just lost its head. I was in my quarters when the alarm sounded. I had been asleep for perhaps 3 hours. I dread in the dark, trousers, boots, the heavy wool jacket that was standard cold weather issue for the garrison, because the consort's quarters were on the west side, and the west side was cold, and I walked out into the corridor. The first person I encountered was a young garrison soldier named Pell, who was 19 years old and had been at Keth Varath for 4 months, and was standing in the corridor with a weapon in his hands, and the particular expression of someone whose training has given them a procedure report, but whose body has not yet been convinced that the procedure applies to the situation they're actually in. "Where's Thess?" I said. "Down," he said. "Eastern corridor, outside the supply gate. Havric is with her. Who has command?" He looked at me. I could see him running the calculation. Who this was, what my standing was, what the answer was to the question I had just asked. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know who has command." "All right," I said. "Come with me." I want to be honest. I did not have a plan at that moment. What I had was 22 years of experience in situations where things were going wrong, and someone needed to be the person who moved toward the problem rather than away from it. And I had a map of Keth Vareth in my head that I had been building for 43 days, and I had the particular cold clarity that comes, for me, when the situation gets bad enough that everything unnecessary falls away. The awareness. My old fleet commander used to call it. The moment when you stop thinking about everything else and you see only what's in front of you. I was in that state by the time I reached the first intersection. The garrison hall was the heart of the fortress, the large central space where, Saren Vol was organizing her remaining forces. I did not go there immediately. First, I went to the Eastern Garrison Wing. The Eastern Wing was cold, 11 degrees, colder than the rest of the fortress because of the blocked heating channels I had been trying to get fixed for 6 weeks. I moved through it quickly, taking stock of what Sovar's advance unit had done and where they were positioned. They had not come in force. 12 fighters, I had been told, and from the evidence of the corridors that number seemed right. They were holding the supply gate and the adjacent storage rooms, which gave them a foothold but not a controlling position. They would be waiting for the main force to come through the pass. I did not try to engage them. I was not armed. I am not a soldier. I want to be clear about that as well. I was a warrant officer who spent 22 years fixing things on military installations, and what I understand is infrastructure, not combat. But infrastructure in a fortress under siege is not a small thing. I found 2 soldiers in the Eastern Wing, a woman named Dav, and a young man whose name I didn't know yet, sheltering in a side room, unsure what to do. I told them to come with me. We went down to the fortress's lowest level, to the thermal plant. Plant was old, but I knew it by then. 6 weeks of studying it, walking through it, tracing the distribution channels, and identifying blockages. I knew where the heat went and where it didn't, and more importantly, I knew where the distribution valves were, and what happened when you redirected. Flow. I spent 40 minutes in the thermal plant. Dev held a light. The young soldier whose name I didn't know. Saret, I learned later. He told me while I was working, handed me tools when I asked for them. What I did was this. I rerouted the eastern heating distribution entirely, redirecting the full output from the plant to the channels serving the Eastern Garrison Wing, rather than sharing it across the fortress. It made everything else colder. It made the Eastern Wing substantially warmer. Not comfortable. Nothing in that fortress was ever comfortable, but warmer. And then, I opened the thermal relief valves on the supply gate channels to their maximum, which would take about 2 hours to reach full effect. When I came back up to the main level, I found Pell waiting for me. He had 3 more soldiers with him. The main force is at the pass mouth, he said. Maybe 2 hours. 2 hours is enough, I said. Come with me. We went to the supply tunnel. The supply tunnel ran under the eastern wall, connecting the exterior storage facility to the fortress interior. It was how Sovar's advance unit had come through the gate. They had come through the tunnel mouth, and then through the gate from inside, bypassing the main wall entirely. If Sovar's main force knew about the tunnel, and they almost certainly did, it was a vulnerability that would let them put fighters into the fortress interior without breaching the walls. The tunnel was 120 meters long, stone-lined, low ceilinged. I walked its length with the 5 soldiers looking at the construction. The ceiling was the original build, 400 years old, the same basalt as the walls, with support frames that had been replaced periodically, but never reconstructed. At the midpoint, there was a section where the frames had been replaced more recently, the wood still relatively pale, and I could see from the construction that the replacement had been done in haste, and the load distribution was not what it should be. I am not going to describe in detail what we did next, partly because it took a long time, and I don't want to make this longer than it needs to be, and partly because the technical details are not the part that matters. What matters is that by the time we finished, the middle section of the supply tunnel was structurally compromised in a way that would not be immediately visible from either end, but would collapse under the weight of a body of fighters moving through it at speed. We came out of the tunnel. I sent Pell and 2 of the others to the garrison hall to report to Sarenvul that the tunnel was closed, and to bring back whatever order she wanted to give me. Dev and Saret I kept with me. You should go to the garrison hall too, Saret said. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The Queen Commander will want. Queen Commander has her hands full, I said, and I'm not done. We went up to the walls. The walls of Keth Varath were the original construction, 400 years of black basalt, 3 meters thick at the base, narrowing toward the top. The walkway along the eastern wall was the part that caught the worst wind, a channeled current that came off the upper peaks and hit the walkway with a force that felt personal, like something was specifically trying to push you off. In winter, the walkway iced. The garrison had a word for it. Sovar's gift, they called it, which I had thought was a local expression before tonight, and now understood was more specifically apt than I had realized. Sovar's main force arrived at the pass mouth at the 2-hour mark, which is precisely what Pell had estimated, and they were larger than the briefing documents had suggested a border faction lord could field. I counted from the wall walkway, difficult in darkness, the torches on the pass road giving only so much, and I made it somewhere between 90 and 110 fighters. Against the 41 soldiers Saren Vowul still had on their feet after Thess went down. They came through the pass in good order, disciplined. Sovar had spent real resources on this, and then they hit the eastern wall approach. I should explain what I had done with the heating channels. Because the eastern wall approach is where it mattered. Relief valves I had opened in the thermal plant were the channels that ran under the eastern courtyard, the stone ground between the outer wall and the supply gate. 400 years ago, a clever Theresi engineer had put those channels there deliberately, because stone ground that is 11 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature in a mountain winter does not ice the way unheated ground does. It had been a defensive feature once. The blocked channels had made it irrelevant for decades. I had unblocked the channels, not to warm the eastern garrison wing, though that was also true, but because I had been standing in that eastern courtyard 6 weeks ago, watching my breath mist and feeling the ice under my boots and thinking about the fact that the courtyard should not be icing if the heating channels were working, and wondering what a few hours of restored heat output would do to ground that had been cold for long enough to build a good crust. What it does, if the crust is thick enough and the ground beneath it warms, is undermine the crust's structural integrity. The surface looks solid. Underneath, the ice has begun to separate from the stone. The crust holds until it doesn't. Sovar's main force came across the eastern courtyard at speed. They were moving fast because the outer gate was already open. The advance unit had opened it to let the main force in, and they had no reason to slow down. The crust held for about 40 fighters. I will not describe what happened when it stopped holding, except to say that it was loud and it was fast, and it was not something any of us on the wall had arranged for. I had not known it would work that well. I had not known the crust was thick enough for that. And when it was over, roughly a third of Sovar's main force was down on the eastern courtyard, and the rest had stopped moving. Saren Vowul led the counterattack from the main gate. I heard it more than I saw it. The garrison hall was on the other side of the fortress, and I was on the eastern wall. But by the time the sky was beginning to show the particular gray that comes before dawn, the fighting had stopped. I sat down on the wall walkway and leaned my back against the stone and listened to the wind. Sarat sat down beside me. He was 21 years old, learned later, 3 years at Kethvarath, and he had the look of someone who had just spent a night outside of what they thought their life was going to contain. "Sir," he said, "what are you?" It was not an unfair question. "I'm the consort," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. "That's not an answer," he said. "No," I said. "I suppose it isn't." We sat there until the sky came up. The count took most of the morning. I was not part of it, officially. I was in the infirmary, which is to say I was standing in the infirmary corridor, while the garrison's medical staff worked, because there was no room inside, and I had discovered early in the night that I had taken a cut across my right forearm at some point. I genuinely could not tell you when, that had gone through the wool jacket and was bleeding more than I had realized. It wasn't serious. It needed cleaning and binding, which a young medic named Corva did for me with the brisk efficiency of someone who had a long list of more pressing cases and was aware of it. Oreth found me there. He was impeccable, as always. I do not know how Oreth manages to look composed in situations that would disorder anyone else, but he does. And on this particular morning, he arrived in the infirmary corridor, with his hands folded and his face arranged in its usual careful neutrality, and stood in front of me for a moment before speaking. "Queen Commander has asked that you attend her in the Great Hall," he said, "when you are able." "I'll come now," I said. "Your arm is bandaged," I said. "I'll come now." The Great Hall was not the same room it had been the night of the feast. Some of the tables had been moved to make space for the injured who couldn't be accommodated in the infirmary. Candles were lit again. The electrical grid was still on the maintenance cycle, and in the early morning light filtering through the high windows, the hall had a quality I couldn't quite name. Like something had happened in it that had changed its dimensions, though of course the dimensions were exactly the same. Saren Vol's surviving commanders were assembled. Most of them were still in their battle gear, what was left of it. Veth Karis was there, with a long bruise along her jaw that she wore the way she wore her battle honors, as information about what she had done, not as evidence of damage. Orith stood to one side. Pel was there, and Sarat and Dav, and 8 or 9 other garrison soldiers who had been part of the night. I came in and stood. I didn't know where to stand specifically, so I stood where I could see the room. Saren Vol was at the far end. She was looking at a document, the count, I understood, the numbers from the night. She did not look up immediately when I entered. She finished reading what she was reading, and then she looked up, and she looked at me. It was not the look from the first day in the courtyard. It was not the look from the feast. It was something else. Something I did not have a word for at first, because I had not seen it on her face before. She was reading a document. I was the document. The supply tunnel, she said. Yes, you brought it down. Structurally compromised, I said. It will need to be rebuilt from the midpoint. I can give you the engineering specifications for a better support system. If the reconstruction is something you want to plan in the near term. The original framework was undersized for the load. There was a silence in the room. I became aware, in that silence, that everyone was looking at me and then looking at her. The eastern courtyard, she said. The heating channels under the eastern approach had been blocked for years. I had filed a maintenance report. I rerouted the thermal plant output 6 weeks ago. I had the forms I can show you, but the valves I opened last night I opened during the siege. I wasn't certain it would work at that scale. I knew it would compromise the surface ice. I didn't know how badly. How did you know about the channels? I've been walking this fortress for 6 weeks, I said. It's what I do. Another silence. Veth Karis said something quietly to the officer beside her. I didn't catch the words. Saren Voul came down the length of the hall toward me. She moved the way she always moved, with the particular economy of someone who has never wasted motion. But there was something different in it now, some quality I was trying to identify, without being obvious about the fact that I was studying her. She stopped a few feet away and looked at me the way she had been looking at the document. Reading something. You were never in the garrison hall, she said. I sent for you 3 times during the night. I know, I said. Pel told me. I sent him back with messages. You needed your commanders at your side, I said. I was more useful elsewhere. You had 41 soldiers who knew how to fight. You didn't need 42. You needed someone who knew where the holes were. She was very still. I called you decoration, she said. It was not phrased as an apology. I want to be accurate about that. It was phrased as a fact being laid on a table, something being acknowledged, and set down carefully, with full understanding of its weight. Thressi do not apologize the way humans do. I knew this from the briefing documents. They account. They name the thing that was wrong and they put it on the record. You did, I said. I was wrong. Yes, I said. She looked at me for another long moment. The fractured amber eyes, the darker rings at the iris, reading something in my face, the same way I had been trying to read something in hers. And then she did something I had not expected. She turned to face the room, not to me, to them. My consort held the eastern approaches last night, she said. 3 soldiers and no orders from me and no weapons and no instruction to do anything except survive. He brought down the supply tunnel. He compromised Sovar's approach through the courtyard. He kept our flank intact when our flank should have broken. She paused. He had been trying to fix that courtyard for 6 weeks. I did not make it easy for him to do his work here. Veth Karis was looking at me now with an expression that was not quite the same as the one she'd worn at the feast. Something had shifted in it. The bruise along her jaw made her look oddly less severe. The council record will reflect, Saren Vowel said, still to the room, that Kael Morrow held the eastern approaches at Keth Verath, and that his work saved this fortress. The council record will also reflect that I have been incorrect in my assessment of what was brought to this household. Another pause, shorter. I do not make that notation lightly. There was no cheering. The Theresi don't do that either. I had learned this at the feast. Even the warmest moments were expressed in a contained way that I had initially read as coldness and had gradually understood was just a different register. The commanders nodded. The garrison soldiers stood straighter. Orith, in the corner, looked precisely as composed as he always looked, which in Orith's case I was beginning to understand was its own kind of statement. Saren Vol turned back to face me. "There are things I want to understand," she said, "about what you did, how you did it. I had a map of this fortress in my head, and your actions last night were not on any version of that map. The map in your head is probably accurate," I said. "I just had a different kind of attention when I was walking it." "What kind?" "The kind that notices where things are cold," I said. "Why?" She looked at me for another moment, the amber eyes, the fractured rings, and then, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone making a choice they are aware of making, she said, "Walk with me." We walked the length of the great hall, out through the corridor, toward the eastern wing. I showed her the thermal plant. I showed her the distribution channels. I showed her the valves I had opened and what they connected to, and the engineering logic of what had been built 400 years ago by someone understood mountain warfare in ways that had apparently been forgotten somewhere in the intervening centuries. She asked questions. The kind that told me she was not asking to understand what I had done but to understand how I had known to do it, is a different and more interesting question. The eastern wing was warm now. Not comfortable. I want to say that clearly, nothing in that fortress was ever comfortable, but warm. She stood in the corridor that had been cold since before she took command of the fortress, her hand flat against the stone wall, and felt the heat in it. "The soldiers have been wearing extra layers in this wing for 2 years," she said. "I know," I said. "Dav told me the first week." She looked at the wall, then she looked at me. "Should have pressed starter for the materials," she said. "The system wasn't responding to pressure," I said. "I was working through it. You could have come to me directly." I considered this. "I didn't think I had that standing," I said honestly. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, it was to the wall more than to me. "You were brought to this household," she said, "with the same standing I have in it." "I was brought to this household as a diplomatic instrument," I said. "Standing and function aren't the same thing." She turned then and looked at me directly. "No," she said, "they are not." We stood in the warm corridor for a moment. "The supply tunnel reconstruction," she said at last. "You said you could give me engineering specifications. I'll have them drafted by tomorrow morning," I said. "And the sensor nodes in the eastern array, the 3 dead nodes. Filed a report on those 11 days ago. I know. I found the report this morning. It was on Orith's desk." A pause. "It should not have been on Orith's desk." "No," I said, "it shouldn't." "I will need someone to oversee the repairs," she said, "and the reconstruction, and the assessment of the other maintenance backlogs in the garrison wing. Someone with the appropriate knowledge." I looked at her. "I'm the consort," I said. "Yes," she said, and her voice was different now, not softer, exactly, because I don't think softness was a register she often used, but something more open, something that had a door in it where there hadn't been one before. "You are." And it turns out I didn't understand what that meant. I will tell you what I have thought, in the time since, about what happened that night. Not the tactical details. I've been through those informal debrief enough times that they've become a kind of separate knowledge, filed away from the actual memory. I mean the other thing, the thing underneath. I spent 43 days walking the corridors of Keth Varath in a state of careful invisibility. Not because I was ashamed of my position or bitter about the mockery at the feast. I have been underestimated enough times in my life to know that correct response is not resentment but patience. Because resentment costs energy you need for other things, and patience costs nothing if you have to do. I had work to do. I did it. And then one night the situation became extreme enough that the work I was doing was the only work that mattered. And the invisibility stopped being possible, not because I chose to become visible, but because the fortress itself made the count of the dead, the collapsed tunnel, the warm courtyard where ice should have been. These were not things I could have arranged to be witnessed. They were just what happened when someone paid attention to a cold wall for 6 weeks and then needed that knowledge in a hurry. Saren Vool put it on the council record. I think about that sometimes. The Theresi are meticulous about their records, more than any species I've encountered. And putting something on the council record is not a gesture. It is a permanent statement. It says, this happened, and we know it happened. And that knowledge belongs to the record of this household. She put my name on the record of Keth Varath. She has, in the time since, made other additions to that record. I am not going to describe those here, because they are between us, and because the details of how a thing like this grows are not the point of this account. The point is the beginning of it. The feast and the mockery and the 6 weeks of invisibility, and then the night when the fortress spoke on my behalf, in a language made of warm stone and broken tunnel supports that had been undermined from the inside. What I know is this: the things you do in the dark, the quiet work, the maintenance reports no one reads, the walls you walk in the cold because your mind cannot leave a problem alone. These things are not lost. They go somewhere. They accumulate. And sometimes, in the space of a single night, they become the only thing that mattered. I did not set out to prove anything to Saren Vool. I want to be honest about that. I set out to fix a heating system that was making 62 soldiers cold, and the night happened to give me a reason to use what I knew. But she saw it. That is the thing I come back to in quiet moments, when the wind off the upper peaks through the arrow slots with its particular breathing sound. She saw it. Not during the night, when there was no seeing anything clearly, but in the morning, when the count was finished, and the document was in her hands, and she looked up at me, across the length of the great hall. She saw it, and she put it on the record. That is enough. That has always been enough. 3 months after the siege, the east wing of Keth Varath was running at proper temperature for the first time in anyone's active memory. The supply tunnel had been rebuilt with a new support system. The engineering specifications, for which I had submitted in draft, formed the morning after the battle, and which Saren Vool had reviewed personally, which I had not expected. The sensor nodes in the eastern approach were repaired. The maintenance backlog was down by about 60%. Oreth had learned to route my requisition forms directly to the Queen commanders. Administrator, rather than leaving them on his own desk, a change he had implemented quietly and without discussion, and which I appreciated. Veth Karis, the senior battle commander who had made the remark at the feast, found me one afternoon in the eastern courtyard. She stood for a moment, looking at the repaved stones where the damaged surface had been reset. Then she looked at me. I said you were here to be fixed to the household, she said. You did, I said. I meant it as a slight. I know. She looked at the courtyard again. Turns out it was accurate, she said. Just not the way I meant it. I considered this. No, I said. Not the way you meant it. She nodded slowly, as though settling something internally. Then she turned and walked back inside. That was the only apology I got from Veth Karis, and it was more than enough. Saren Vool came to the eastern wall at dusk, the evening of the 3rd month's end. The day I had the final maintenance sign-off submitted. She stood at the same section of walkway where I had sat with Sarat on the morning after the siege, and she looked out at the pass. I stood beside her. The wind was doing its thing, the channeled current off the upper peaks, the sound like breathing in an old language. Both quiet for a while. The council reviewed the siege account last week, she said. The full record. I know, Oreth told me. They asked me to characterize your role. I waited. I told them, she said, that my consort knew this fortress better than I did, and that Keth Varath is standing because of it. The wind moved through the arrow slots. Below us in the eastern courtyard, the new stones caught the last of the light. That's accurate, I said. Yes, she said, it is. She was quiet for another moment, then she said, not to the past but to me. I have been thinking about what you said. That you didn't press harder for the materials because you didn't think you had standing. I remember. I want you to press harder, she said, for anything, for whatever you need. If the system doesn't respond, come to me. You have standing in this household. I intend for that to be understood. By the household, by the administrators, anyone who handles your requisition forms. I appreciate that, I said. She turned to look at me. The amber eyes, the fractured rings, and in the last of the dusk light, something in them I had not seen before. Not recognition exactly, because that had already happened, on the morning after the siege in the Great Hall. But something that came after recognition, something more like intention. There is a great deal of this fortress that I have not been paying the right kind of attention to, she said. Not just the maintenance. I looked back at her. I have the same kind of attention, I said. I'll walk it with you. She was quiet for one more moment, then, in the Theresi way. Not warmth exactly, because warmth was not quite her register, but openness. That door that had appeared in her voice the morning after, and had not closed since, she said. Then walk with me. We walked the fortress as the dark came down. She asked questions, and I answered them. And I asked questions, and she answered those. And the wind came through the arrow slots with its breathing sound. And Keth Varath held the pass the way it had always held it, patient and cold and solid to the bone. I had found, somewhere in 43 days of walking its corridors, a place that suited me. I did not say this aloud. I didn't need to. The record already had it.